Thank you, Marjorie. I was delighted that you were able to give time to do this introduction today. Marjorie and I go back a long way, and I think she's pretty wonderful, and her achievements are remarkable. But her generosity and humor are also very stimulating and uplifting, and a sense of irony, a healthy sense of irony. What I'm going to do today is talk about writing and the arts in connection with the First World War in Canada. And I'll do it so that you know ahead of time. I'll do it in four sections. So if you get bored, you can see that the end is coming, or you know how far you are from the end. Thank you very much for coming. Some of you I know have come a long way and through traffic, etc., and I greatly appreciate your being here in this beautiful room, I might add, in the library that houses the archives that make work by contemporary writers on the Great War possible. As you'll see, I have a lot to say about archives. Now, let's hope the technology works. There was a wonderful man here who got everything going. In Canada, the Great War has traditionally been viewed as the event that forged a modern nation out of a country that still seemed to be a British colony. However, when Pierre Berton drew this conclusion in his celebrated history of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, called Vimy, he was sending readers something of a mixed message. On the one hand, he was reiterating dogma, because the myth of a nation coming of age in that war, specifically on Vimy Ridge, was in force in the 1980s when he published the book, and today it continues to circulate and receive endorsement in the dominant discourse about the war. On the other hand, Berton's words like justify, excuses, justification, as well as the factual statement that the war did not end all wars, opens up the idea of an alternate discourse, a discourse that refutes or qualifies many of the claims so often made about the First World War. Today I want to pursue Pierre Berton's mixed message by exploring a few examples from our literature and the arts in which the questions implicit in his remark are addressed. Did Canada come of age in that war or in one significant battle? What do we mean by the name or the term Canada in this context? Do nations ever come of age through war? In what other ways, on what other landscapes might we look for Canadian coming of age stories? What about all the Canadians who did not fight in the war? Canada, after all, was very blessed insofar as it was not an actual battleground like Europe. And Canadian civilians here at home were not swept up in actual combat. How might I then describe the impact of that war on the home front? Or to put this slightly differently, what has been the legacy for the nation of the war or of a specific battle like Vimy Ridge? Since 1977 and the publication of Timothy Finley's magisterial novel, The Wars, many Canadian writers of fiction and nonfiction and playwrights have revisited the story of Vimy and of the war more generally. Recent feature films and documentaries have re-examined the past. Exhibitions of art commissioned from war artists have been mounted and toured the country in carefully curated shows with important accompanying catalogues. The War Museum in Ottawa was opened in 2005, and it displays some of this original artwork from its permanent collection in a historical context that makes a lot of sense for contemporary, our eyes. If a picture really is worth 1,000 words, then one could argue, certainly I would, that the rediscovery of this art, stored out of sight for many decades, has played a crucial role in addressing those worrisome terms in Pierre Berton's remark. Obviously, I can only touch upon a few examples from the literature today, but before I turn to the primary works, I want to set the stage briefly. Although I will not take time to describe the dominant narrative of the war beyond Berton's comments, It is necessary to acknowledge that some contemporary historians have challenged the claims made for Vimy and for what Jonathan Vance, Canadian military historian, has called the myth of the Great War. Nevertheless, such myths die hard, and there are many ways in which the dominant story continues to circulate, from the yearly observance of the armistice in November the 11th ceremonies, the selling of poppies on street corners, and the reciting in schools of John McCrae's famous poem In Flanders Fields, to popular histories, newspaper articles, and official veterans' websites, including the online Memory Project. In short, Canadians continue to be told that the nation was forged in the Great War. It is only if readers or viewers or theater-goers look more closely at the novels, memoirs, plays, and exhibitions that have appeared since 1977 that they will detect an alternate discourse, one more critical of this nation-building story, one much more complex and nuanced and interesting, and one that stresses a broader inclusivity of the home front as a serious landscape of memory and identity. After I sketch some general context for cultural production in literature and the arts of the period, and briefly describe the formative influence of Finlay's The Wars, I will focus on three texts: our own Jack Hodgins' Broken Ground, Vern Thiessen's play Vimy, and David McFarlane's memoir, The Danger Tree. For each of these texts, it is useful to identify some of the narrative strategies that distinguish them from what I call eyewitness combat texts. Finally, I'll conclude my discussion with some reflections on how the centenary of the war has been marked in Canada thus far. So, I promised you archives. Finlay's The Wars not only won the Governor-General's Award for Fiction in 1977, but was also published in Canada by a Canadian publisher. It became, overnight, a best-selling literary success, with reviewers discussing it, debating its presentation of the war, and praising its narrative techniques. Canadians were, as Finlay asked his readers to do, paying attention. The novel quickly gained iconic status amongst scholars, younger writers, like Jane Urquhart and Joseph Boyden, for example, and with general readers. It would soon be widely translated, made into a film, and then later into a play. It has been and continues to be taught in high schools and universities, and it has never been out of print. Suffice it to say, then, that Finlay did things with narrative structure, point of view, or focalization, and voice, thematic development of a theme that at that point had received little attention in Canada, and with historical fact that showed the way for his own and later generations of writers to go if, for whatever reason, they chose to think about their country and the Great War. The wars taught all of us where to begin, with archives, photographs, material culture, facts, and memory. How a writer would work with the fragments of history, what they decided to say about them, and how to recreate the war were the challenges. This how and what are inextricable in practice, of course, but I want to briefly separate them to identify what was so innovative about Finlay's The Wars and about how he set about constructing his text, because his narrative strategies would prove so influential. The fundamental condition for writing The Wars, as well as my other post-1977 texts, is memory, in the context of accurate history. These authors, born long after the war, have to work with and from memory and the received historical facts. Hence the importance of the archive, and those fragments Finlay's narrator in the novel begins with. It goes without saying that these memory works, as I call them, the post-1977 texts, differ greatly from works composed by First World War combatants or civilian eyewitnesses of that period. But let me list a few common features of first-hand combat and eyewitness fiction. I'm going to leave this slide up. I'm not going to go through it in any great detail, but I'll make a few observations and you can look at it as I go. The first two characteristics on my list can be passed over with just one aside. The presentness in memory texts is the present of remembering or trying to remember long after the events have passed into history. My third characteristic does carry forward to the wars and my other post-1977 texts. However, the conditions of masculinity explored in these memory works are much broader, richer, and more complex. Finley's men, like Hodgson's, Thiesen's, McFarlane's, like Joseph Boyden's in his 3-Day Road, differ from each other. They are human beings, not killing machines or faceless cannon fodder. While today's texts include the experience of battle, my fourth point, they stress the home front, my fifth point. And the so-called hero, an identity often critiqued in the recent books, must share the life-storying, remembering stage with others, other men, women, children, and hey, with animals. And the wisdom achieved through the characters and the process of remembering usually leads to a condemnation of war by a witness inside the text and or by us, readers, theater goers. In short, there is a carefully constructed ethical perspective in these memory works that exists but rarely and not to the same extent in the combat ones. The heart of this brief comparison between combat and memory works lies with the question of narrative style and fictional mode. That's my sixth point. This is also where today's writers face their greatest artistic challenge. If the combat texts were realist, using the aspects of realism I note in my sixth point, then what will we say the wars, Broken Ground, Vimy, or a memoir like The Danger Tree are? Memory texts about the war must observe historical facts. They must have a coherent, accurate narrative through line. The First World War happened then, in those places, with those casualties. The writer cannot confuse Passchendaele with Dieppe, Gallipoli with Ortona, the destruction of Ypres with Hiroshima, Dresden, London. Beginning with the archive then, facts, dates, numbers, memory texts from the wars on, problematize the story of war through irony, multiple perspectives on the story, and a clear self-reflexivity. Moreover, truth claims, that is, truth with capital T here, truth claims are scrutinized, debated, and conclusions that bring resolution or reconciliation with tragedy, loss, trauma, atrocity are withheld. At their best, these memory works invite active reader response, enable the process of secondary witnessing, and aim to create what American historian Dominique Lacapra calls empathic unsettlement. Finley's The Wars exemplifies these characteristics and narrative strategies. Briefly, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the novel, the story is about a young Canadian, Robert Ross, who enlists, is wounded, returns to the front where he is severely traumatized by the use of gas, by the terrible deaths of his fellows, and by his rape by men who are very likely his fellow officers. He rebels against the senseless orders of his captain in order to save a barn full of horses when their signal station comes under enemy bombardment. He kills this commanding officer. He goes AWOL with the rescued horses. He's caught, arrested, and court-martialed. He dies, age 26, as a result of the severe burns received during his arrest when the military police set the barn in which he was resting with the horses on fire. Back home, his mother, a powerful presence in the novel, father and siblings wait and mourn. Mrs. Ross rages against the war, the militaristic patriotism preached at her in church, and her inability to keep her children alive. Simple. Simple plot. Boy goes to war, boy dies, people grieve, etc. However, the story of Robert Ross is gathered together by a fictional biographer inside the novel who struggles to rescue some modicum of fact and life from the fragments in the archive, from official history, from those family members who will talk to him, and from 2 crucial interviews with women who knew Robert during the war. These 3 narrators are all working from memory. The biographer, the 2 elderly women remembering Robert, and they hold him in high esteem. Their fictional eyewitness accounts, tape recorded and transcribed for us, complicate the story, introduce many other players into the main biographical historical plot, and infuse history, official documents, and public events with characters' personal emotions and reflections. Where the army and Robert's brother, who will not speak to the biographer, condemn Robert as a coward and a criminal, and where others consider him insane, the 2 elderly women consider Robert un homme unique, absolutely sane and courageous. To them it was the war that was mad, and officers like Robert's captain who were insane killers. Our role as secondary witnesses outside the text is to work with all this gradually accumulated information from many different and conflicting sources. Like the biographer, we also study several different intertexts, peer closely at important photographs, and listen carefully to the testimony and ethical judgments of the characters. To make sense of this complex material, we must also read back and forth across the sections of the book, which are placed to disrupt a smooth chronology. For example, the novel opens with a terrifying scene that happens towards the end of Robert's story. This placement produces an immediate sense of uncertainty in the reader and demands that we pay attention, very close attention, if we hope to understand what follows. At the end, we are left with a description of a photograph of Robert and his disabled sister, Rowena, in happier times before the war. This is the hope, such as it is, held out at the end. Look, you can see our breath, and you can. There is no tidy conclusion to the story, no final summation, no reconciliation with a terrible past, no laying to rest of ghosts. Robert, Mrs. Ross, and many other characters will continue to haunt a reader long after the book is finished, and the weighty questions raised by the novel remain with us. So now to the 3 texts I wanted to share my comments about with you. In Broken Ground, Jack Hodgins revisits the Great War in many ways, but most of the revisiting takes place on the broken ground of home in an actual returned soldier settlement in the town of Merville on Vancouver Island. The narrative present of the story is 1996. Try to hang on to that date, by which time the war stories and traumatic memories of the early veteran settlers have almost been erased from the contemporary settlement's memory. Therefore, to convey the past to the reader, Hodgins creates Charlie McIntosh, an octogenarian witness and storyteller, the son of one of those first soldier settlers. At the center of old Charlie's remembering is another returned soldier, Matthew Pearson, an ex-teacher attempting to become a farmer and to forget his terrible experiences in the war. But there is another ex-soldier called Donald McCormack, who sits silently on the margins of the community and of the remembering until the crisis occurs in that 1966 year that prompts Charlie to do his research in order to tell the whole or much of its story of Portuguese Creek and the returned soldier settlement at Merville by going back to 1922, when the families began to clear, that is, as we say in Canada, to break the land for farms and houses. The novel opens with a long section called Voices from Portuguese Creek, The compilation of brief interviews, remembered events, scenes and stories within stories, historical facts. There really was a fire in 1922 that nearly destroyed this tiny community. From newspaper items and so on, provide the remembered landscape for Charlie's present 1996 story. We meet all the residents, listen to them by turns, see others from multiple perspectives, register the many different interpretations of events, and come to value a community leader like Matt Pearson. Although we are made aware of a silent presence in a wheelchair, sitting on the Pearsons' porch with a leather mask over his face, we never hear him speak and only learn a little about his war wounds from the neighbors or the curious, gossiping children. Until, that is, the fateful moment in 1996 when, as it were, this physical embodiment of memory breaks the silence to shatter his neighbor's forgetting with the pain of its individual human truth. When the community gathers in 1996 to watch the film made about their collective past by a young grandson of one of the settler families, they see that the filmmaker has only captured or selected for his story one version of this complicated history. The war, in fact, has been left out, along with the trauma the veterans brought back from France with them, a collective trauma that has, almost literally, taken root in the broken ground of the settlement, and the suffering represented by the faceless Donald McCormack, sitting silently in his wheelchair with the audience. As the film draws to its close, however, a subdued disturbance is heard in the audience. A voice rises in a growling scream. Other voices try to hush this noise. But it increases in volume until Charlie realizes that it is Donald who is trying to talk. He was talking. I was close enough to know that, Charlie tells us, though it was the kind of talk that made no language sense. Finally, Donald stands up, but refuses to be led away. The film stops, the house lights come up, and there he is, growling, waving one arm, and then he rips off the leather mask that had protected his neighbors from reality for so many years. It was hard to believe, Charlie concludes, that this calamity had been amongst us all these years without our seeing it. The calamity amongst the people of Portuguese Creek is, of course, this tragic ex-soldier. But it is also the past war that people have tried to forget. Since Donald cannot explain the importance of remembering in words we understand, Charlie decides to take on this responsibility. The result is the novel, Broken Ground, a story about the Great War, about settling unbroken land in the Canadian West, about building a community and part of a country after the war on home ground. This terrible primal scene at the film screening comes near the end of the novel for the reader, and Charlie has already filled up the gaping holes in memory by the time we reach this scene. The delayed telling, however, increases, I think, the impact of the scene when we finally get there, and of the entire text, insofar as we are suddenly aware of having been tangentially aware of something almost hidden from sight all along, of this ghostly presence that has haunted the voices from Portuguese Creek and the many stories these folks have told us. What I think I have to stress is that Hodgins rejects almost every characteristic of those conventional combat works and delves into the caveats raised by Pierre Berton. Home ground is the essential location of this war story about a nation coming of age. Memory is the modus operandi of the narrative. Many characters within Charlie's reconstruction bear fictional primary witness to what some of them call the great fuck-up, while Charlie himself, a mere child during the war, bears powerful secondary witness to the war and primary witness to its long-term impact on the man he sees as a hero, Matt Pearson, a character, however, in the novel, who is all too human and not heroic. Vern Thiessen's Vimy is one of several contemporary Canadian plays about the First World War. In his playwright note to the published text, Byrne suggests that he wanted to crawl inside one small corner of a large offensive to discover how small actions can define us as individuals and as a nation. The large offensive he's referring to is the Battle of the Somme, huge. And he chose possibly the most iconic battle for Canada of the entire war. He also insists that he was not writing to criticize or celebrate the war or the Battle of Vimy Ridge, so much as to explore what he calls the no man's land between reality and memory, truth and dream, history and mythology. He is precise about the reality, the truth, and the history. The battle took place between the 9th and 12th of April, 1917, when 4 divisions of Canadian troops fought together for the first time under the command of a Canadian, who would be General Arthur Currie. Of the 10,602 casualties, 3,598 men died, 4 Canadians received the Victoria Cross, and at least 4 more were executed by their fellow soldiers for failing to take part. But Thiessen is more interested in the memories and experiences of his 5 living characters and his 1 ghost. Technically, this is a memory play. The cover of the published play shows the First Nations soldier played by a First Nations actor. I'll get to more in a minute. Technically, this is a memory play set in a primitive field hospital after the battle as the characters remember together and individually. The only battle scene is a reenactment. The characters, 5 men and 1 woman, come from different regions of Canada, so that when they remember home, they are superimposing specific home fronts on their shared battlefront. They are a Blood Indian from Alberta, a French Canadian from Montreal, a canoe maker from Ontario, and a construction worker from Manitoba who is gay. The nurse, Claire, is from Nova Scotia, as is her fiancé, Laurie, the man killed in this battle, who will appear only to her as a ghost, or if it's a live production, only to her and to us. Thiessen insists that the play not be staged realistically. The premiere was in a quasi-expressionist style, which facilitates the complex dream sequences of the story. Of the 3 epigraphs Byrne Thiessen chose for his text, the key one, I think, is this famous remark attributed to a First Nations elder who challenged a white settler when that man claimed Canada as his country. If this is your country, where are your stories? Tell me your stories. In this play, we will listen to the stories that, as Thiessen imagines them, contribute to the story of Canada as it was experienced at Vimy Ridge. The central action of the play is the telling of these stories that bring memories of home into the present, of injury, suffering, and death. Much of this material is what, in theater, is called backstory. But in this play, we share in the remembering, reliving of the home front pasts and are able to understand how the war has affected and changed these men and their nurse. Offstage sound effects and lighting bring their memories of the actual fighting into this present. And in one centrally important scene, the wounded men get up from their cots to relive how they practice the famous Vimy glide and how they fought together. As they practice, they repeat in French and English, "We need to work fast, we need to work smart, we need to work together, nous devons travailler ensemble." In other words, these men reenact that process of coming together, united in a shared purpose as a nation, and we are positioned as their witnesses to legitimate this working together. In this one sense, then, Thiessen reaffirms the myth of Canada being born as a nation in battle on Vimy Ridge. However, he qualifies and expands upon the received history in several ways. He includes in this fragment of his citizen army an Indian, a Francophone, and a homosexual Canadian. He places a woman, the nurse Claire, in a central position as a co-rememberer and a citizen of importance. And he features trauma, perhaps the most shocking example of which is Jean-Paul's horror at being forced to participate in the execution of a fellow soldier and close friend who refused to follow orders to speak only in English and to kill the Hun. Moreover, he establishes the home front as even more significant than the battlefront when it comes to individual and national identity. It is these people's deeply moving memories of home that saturate this play with meaning. And finally, he does not wrap up his play with anything approaching resolution or reconciliation, let alone a happy ending that celebrates victory in battle at Vimy. One more soldier will die, the other three will return home, taking their wounds with them, and Claire will mourn her dead Laurie for the rest of her life. McFarlane's autobiography, The Danger Tree, Memory War, and the Search for a Family's Past, is a special case in my context for two reasons. The first is that at the time of the First World War, Newfoundland was still a separate British dominion with its own stamps and currency and a fierce pride in its unique identity. I think it still has that fierce pride. It joined Canadian Federation, as you know, in 1949, and today it is formally known as Newfoundland and Labrador. The second reason for my special case classification is its genre. Not only is it autobiographical, a story about David McFarlane's growing up as a Canadian in Ontario and searching for his ancestors and the Great War, but it is also a biography of the Goodyear family of Grand Falls, Newfoundland, his mother's family, and of the Goodyear men who enlisted in the Great War and did not return. But there's a further reason for singling out this book. McFarlane has created an interestingly complicated representation of being and becoming Canadian, in which the Danger Tree becomes a national biography too. It tells the tragic story of how one family's identity was transformed by the war from one definition to another, from Newfoundlander to Canadian, while simultaneously enriching our sense of who we were and have come to be. Those lost Goodyear men are remembered as part of a doubled national story. Some facts are necessary here. The Danger Tree, which no longer exists on the memorial site at Beaumont-Hamel, but this gives you an idea of what you would see if you go to that particular war memorial. The Danger Tree was a shattered tree trunk that raised its broken and leafless arms above the battlefield at Beaumont-Hamel, where on the 1st of July in 1916, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment was decimated. The Newfoundlanders, McFarlane tells us, went over just after 9 o'clock, but there were no accompanying advances on either side of their flanks. The Newfoundlanders walked straight into all the enemy's fire. Of the 780 officers and young men of the regiment, about 100 survived. A terrible percentage when you think of it, of the population of future fathers and husbands in Newfoundland. The rest perished in about 30 minutes. Later, one survivor and witness described the disaster. The few who did come through the last line of wire, as if bursting through a hedge, found themselves only as far forward as a single dead, gnarled tree that rose like a skeleton from the lip of a shell hole. It was a landmark the Newfoundlanders used to mark the beginning of no man's land. They called it the Danger Tree. I always find that a hard one to read. It's quite a memory, quite a disaster. Today, when the rest of the country celebrates Canada Day on July 1st, the people of Newfoundland and Labrador are also remembering Beaumont-Hamel. In this autobiography, McFarlane is telling the rest of us to remember the Great War and its significance for a contemporary nation called Canada. As a life story, The Danger Tree has all the textual elements we expect in autobiography, and many of those now familiar in contemporary fictional narratives that remember the war. History is respected, even as its capital T truths are challenged. The book has a map showing readers the island of Newfoundland with the town of Grand Falls near its center. It has an insert showing the island in relationship to eastern Canada. And there are photographs, much like those Finlay described in The Wars. Old, slightly torn, faded images from the family archive. And there are passages from actual letters, newspaper headlines, conversations that resemble interviews with surviving family members, and towards the end, a surprise letter, dated almost a century ago, that surfaces from beneath a mix of papers in an old box. This letter answers a question and revises the accepted version of what happened to one of the Goodyear men. And I'm not going to tell you what that letter reveals, but I will urge you to read The Danger Tree. It is a beautiful book. So, for what? Some reflections. The title for my concluding remarks, for what, comes from this famous painting by Canadian war artist Frederick Varley. At the time it was created in 1918-19, and for several decades afterwards, it was rarely seen by Canadians. But since 1977 and its reproduction in Heather Robertson's book, A Terrible Beauty, it has become a familiar and iconic image of the war, and, I must stress, of the alternative narrative of that war that Pierre Berton identified and that so many post-1977 writers explore. Historian Margaret Macmillan has called her 2013 book about the First World War, The War That Ended Peace. And perhaps that is one answer to Varley's question. As we continue the 4-year period of remembering, it is important, I think, to keep Varley's question in mind and to reflect on the irony, the bitter irony, of Margaret Macmillan's answer. Of course, Canadian remembering is only a small part of the European and British remembering that reaches Canada through the news. Britain, France, Belgium, Austria, Germany, indeed many countries have been holding special events of commemoration. Canadian attention thus far has been surprisingly muted, or so it seems to me. The Canadian War Museum has mounted special exhibitions, some tour. The CBC has prepared special shows about the war. On television, Macmillan has been interviewed. First Nations soldier Francis Pegamegabo his story has reached a much wider audience, and about time. He is an inspiring figure in Joseph Boyden's 3-Day Road. And other shorter features on medals and individual soldiers are appearing. On radio, the CBC has resurrected its interviews with Great War veterans, first broadcast to mark the 50th anniversary of the start of the war, and it is called The Bugle and the Passing Bell. You can go online and listen to it. Some of those old gentlemen and their memories from the start of the war are very moving. Major magazines like Canadian Geographic have published interesting feature articles about the war that expand the parameters of what that war meant and who was involved. In the October 2016 issue, they featured a map of the Vimy Barrage, the barrage plan for which the soldiers did the Vimy Glide. And they had an article on Great War, World War aces, air aces. Other interesting sites of remembrance include 3 that I want to make a few comments about. One was an article in the Globe and Mail on the 27th of August 2016 by John Alamang about the renaming of a town in southern Ontario. Another one is a thoughtful documentary film called Tricks on the Dead about Chinese laborers. And the third one is a new opera, which delights me, about the Royal Newfoundlanders called Ours. Some of you may not know that 100 years ago, today's city called Kitchener in Ontario was called Berlin, and that its Germanic heritage was erased from the Ontario map when, as John Alamang calls them, bullies and xenophobes won a battle for control of our national identity. The city's name was changed to recognize the British military hero Lord Kitchener, And I draw attention to Alamang's article because it is such a sharp reminder of how history and cartography can be rewritten to support an official script, and in the process, of course, erase an actual history. Tricks on the Dead, a 2015 film by BC filmmaker Jordan Peterson, uncovers a little-known aspect of Canada's role in the Great War. In it, Peterson traces the journey of 85,000 laborers from mainland China who were shipped from their homes and secretly transported to camps in Canada, William Head on Vancouver Island being one, and then taken again secretly and under guard by train to the East Coast. From there, they were shipped to France to dig trenches, and the story of their treatment is far from pretty. It is important, however, to unearth such stories because they challenge and complicate sanitized versions of a noble patriotic war. Ours is the most recent creative work and the only Canadian opera about the war, to my knowledge, and it explores the aftermath of Beaumont Hamel for the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, its Catholic chaplain, Thomas Nangle, and the identity of Newfoundland as a province. The opera was commissioned by Opera on the Avalon, and it premiered in St. John's on, when else but the 1st of July 2016, the centenary of Beaumont Hamel. John Estacio, our most accomplished opera composer, wrote the music with a libretto by Newfoundland playwright Robert Chafe. And Estacio has generously sent me some production photos to share with you today. I have yet to see a production, but you can listen to clips on YouTube, as I have, and the opera, I'm told, is expected to tour next year. I sure hope so. However, just looking at these slides John Estacio sent me, it's a big production with a large cast and a large chorus and elaborate set design, and it's got an extensive orchestra because that's how Estacio writes, and it's going to be costly. I just hope somehow the money will be found to make this possible to tour. But go on YouTube, you can hear bits. The music is very accessible and quite lovely. Descriptions and reviews to date praise its emotional power and importance for Newfoundlanders, of course, but also for the rest of Canada, for remembering the terrible cost of that war, and that, as many have claimed, Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949 in part because of the loss of a generation at Beaumont Hamel. The name Ours puzzled me at first, but that is apparently how Newfoundlanders refer to their men in that regiment, as ours. And one aim of the opera is to locate them in what the artistic director calls a legacy for all Canadians. Just a side note, tonight at 8 o'clock, the CBC is broadcasting a special feature about the Great War, focusing on Newfoundland. I think that's a first. So something here is changing quite interestingly in the landscape of Canadian identity remembering in terms of the Great War and its impact. Something I'm going to see, and maybe you will as well. But I want to return to Varley's question for what? Why? How? And what are we remembering? What is the message conveyed by these many different events and offerings? Are we merely reinscribing received myths and reinforcing unquestioned rhetoric about coming of age or forging a nation on a battlefront? Well, yes and no. Judging from the title of a recent exhibition in Edmonton, Forging a Nation, Canada Goes to War, the familiar story dies hard. Similarly, the bright cover of the Canadian Geographic, with its iconic poppies, proclaims that there are 100 ways in which the First World War shaped Canada. And so the idea of being shaped by this war lives on. However, when one opens the magazine, one finds a richer, more complex narration of the nation than the one Pierre Burton had challenged so many years ago. Now the contributions of women are recognized. First Nations soldiers receive attention, and the entire landscape of home is mapped actually mapped. There's a map showing it to mark where non-combat shaping took place. By and large, I still see very little critical attention being paid to the causes and failures of imagination that led to the war. Macmillan's book is a wonderful exception, as is Gwyn Dyer's article, also in the Globe and Mail, called "What If the Kaiser Had Won the War?" Or attention paid to the aftermath of the trauma resulting from the war. Perhaps the new opera Hours will be an exception here. And surely this aftermath did as much to shape the country as battles won or lost could do. To the best of my current knowledge, military executions like those represented so powerfully by Jack Hodgins and Vern Thiessen, or violence done by Canadians instead of violence done to them, are not mentioned in the media or in official events. Instead, we are enjoined as patriotic citizens to think of sacrifice, glory, service, and an evil enemy, or still more problematic, at least problematic until last February 2016, we were expected to support efforts to erect this massive sculpture representing the figure of Mother Canada on the Vimy Monument on the beautiful Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia. But lest we forget, there is always that alternative stories, in fact many stories, and there are other ways of remembering while moving forward into this century. Finlay, Hodgins, Thiessen, McFarlane, just a sample of those I might mention. I discuss many more in my book, Landscapes of Memory. These people have created those other stories and those other ways of remembering. Margaret Atwood put this injunction to remember especially well, I feel, when she said that we, by this she meant Canadians and all human beings, tend to remember the awful things done to us and to forget the awful things we did. For a nation to truly come of age, surely, it must remember both and learn from the remembering. I think Timothy Finlay put this best in his remarks about Remembrance Day. He wrote that remembrance is more than honoring the dead. Remembrance is joining them, being one with them in memory, and memory is survival. Thank you very much for coming, for listening, and sharing with me some of these observations about remembering. That's where I will leave my remembering for the moment, and would love to hear if you have any rememberings, questions, comments.
Before that, I'd like us all to thank Sherril for that talk. So please join me. Ask her questions.
I have a question. What's the Vimy glide that you mentioned? What is that?
Let me just pause long enough to ask if the questions from the audience are being picked up, because this is being taped. Dick, the question was, what is the Vimy line?
Glide.
Glide. Oh, okay. The Vimy glide, like as you saw the men practicing in that production photo from the play. The Canadian military had come up with a strategy, a barrage, rolling barrage strategy, to conduct their attack on Vimy Ridge, which is to people living on the West Coast where we have mountains, it's barely a hill, because it had been held by the Germans through several attempts to take it and hold it. And this Vimy glide barrage meant that men advancing, and I hope I'm not a military historian, I hope I'm explaining this well, if not Marlene will help. They had to advance with precise timing, and there would be a barrage that went over them. And that barrage had to land just beyond them so that they did not get caught in their own friendly fire, but so that there would be a screen that went up and barbed wire and other things would be cleared out of the way. And they had to glide forward down behind this rolling barrage as it moved closer and closer to the German lines. And they had to practice and perform it to perfection so that in the actual battle they didn't get ahead of themselves and get wiped out. Is that okay, Marlene?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Good, okay. Hi.
Thanks, Sherril. Always rely upon you for some direction as to what to read at this time of the year. So, the Danger Crew will appear in my shop shortly. My grandfather, Willie McIntyre, was gassed near Plug Street to the English at Ypres. He survived the war, but was horribly disabled in consequence and died before I was born. He died in 1935. I always find it fascinating that my memory goes to Willie and Ypres rather than to Vimy Ridge, even though I've read Burton and try to understand it well. But maybe it just says how our remembering is tremendously personal and how we impose certain meaning upon that which we were exposed. So, no question.
Yeah, the miserable deaths of men from the gassing were appalling, and it was Canadians were the first to be victimized by that. They were the first to encounter that, and then, however, they turned around and used it, and you know. So there's you've read Timothy Finley's The Wars, I'm pretty sure, yeah. And there's an absolutely extraordinary scene of that gassing, the first Canadian experience of gassing in Timothy Finley's novel, yeah.
There's an excellent BBC Press book, missing the title. The gas.
Yes.
So I was curious about both, so in The Wars, the I guess narrator sort of tracks the characters through archival materials, but did Timothy Finley actually use archival materials? And then I was also curious about in Vimy, the diverse characters that are represented there, are those sort of drawn from life? Did the author of the play find sort of representative people in the archives that he then sort of brought to life in the play?
It's a librarian's question, and I love it. And the answer to both is yes and yes, but let me give you a bit more information. Timothy Finley had an uncle, his father's brother, an older brother, who fought in the Great War and was seriously injured. Like Ken's grandfather, would come home and would die very early. I think in that case, that Finley uncle died in 1936. The family, he was a war hero, military, blah, blah, all of those things. Anyway, the Finley family of Toronto came close to worshipping this war hero son. They kept all his letters and diaries. He was an officer, and so they kept all this material. And I can't tell you how. I believe it must have been a member of the family, sister, and then possibly somebody they hired to type it up and put it into an order, created a war journal of this soldier's experiences. And Timothy Finley knew this uncle. He knew him when he was just a child himself, before he died, and then inherited the journal. When it came time to write The Wars, one of the main archival sources that he had at hand was that extraordinary journal. And I have looked at it, and I've gone back and looked at the novel, and it's clear at certain points, and in other talks I've actually analyzed this, at certain points Finley has taken a passage from the uncle's journal, moved it into the novel, and changed it just enough. It's really, really subtle, clever changes, but in the accumulation of this in the novel, the uncle is not passing judgment. He's just reporting, and he would have had to be very careful, even as an officer, about what he sent out, or what he kept. And Finley's biographer in The Wars, however, is inflecting these comments to give an ethical perspective to these accounts. Now, in addition to that, Timothy Finley grew up at the kitchen and dining room tables hearing stories about the Great War, and also the Second World War, which was his war. That's the war that he lived through as a kid. So the Great War and the Second World War were part of his growing up. But he loved archives. And yes, he did a lot of archival work. At that stage in 1977, he did it all himself. Later on, when he's famous, he has somebody doing archival research for him. But his own archives, which are in Library Archives Canada, are stuffed with his research. Facts. What did you wear? What did you drive? What did the streets of Toronto look like? What happened in this battle? What happened in that battle? On the ships going over, what were the soldiers given to eat? How were they berthed? What happened to the horses going? I mean, all of these details he's gone into, and some of the photographs he describes, some of the battle scenes he describes. He's had to go and do historical research as well, and he loved it. And so, yes. Now, the other question was about the play, Vern Thiessen's Vimy. That's a really good one. There is a nurse, her name was Claire Gass, Gass, from Nova Scotia. And she was a nurse with Canadian field hospitals in the First World War. She kept a diary, and that diary has been published by a Canadian historian. It's a fascinating diary, and Vern Thiessen knew about that diary. And his nurse in his play is called Claire. And he drew upon that diary, which he could do because it had been published, because a scholar had come along and put the edition together and published it. He also had, of course, to do other kinds of research in order to get some of his facts right. And he, too, like Finley, was obsessed with we have to be. You know, you can't deal with something like that and make a mess of the factual information. But the thing that isn't necessarily known is that he actually went to that diary kept by Claire Gass. Yeah. Great question. Archives. I wouldn't be here without them. Are there other thoughts or questions? Yes.
It's more of a comment to uphold your conclusion that the stage of the way we basically look at the First World War, the memory of the First World War, is actually one that's moving. Our remembrance is changing, not just because of the time, but also because of the demographics of the country as well. But I think I recently was at a conference in London where a young lady was talking about the Newfoundland Naval Regiment, or the Naval Reserve, which had a far more powerful role in the First World War than the much smaller Canadian Navy, because they had far greater men available. And it's also that the stage in terms of who was at war is changing, so that we're not just looking at men in army regiments at war, but we're also looking at naval regiments, and incredibly so, we're also looking at this role of women at places like Gallipoli, where Canadian nurses had a major function, and at hospital places like Suez. So our cartography of Canadians at war is also changing. It is really becoming a world war as opposed to just the Western Front. And I think that's quite an exciting period in terms of memory of war in Canada.
I, of course, as you can see, agree with you. Thank you for that comment. I agree with you entirely. It's a much more interesting story, a much more evolving and complex story. One of the things that impressed me some years ago when I first read it was Boyden's novel 3-Day Road. All I knew at that point, when did Joseph publish 3-Day Road? It's been several years now. But when? 2005. Thank you, my love. up to that point, I had been, if tangentially, only tangentially aware that there'd been First Nations men who signed up, or why they might have sent them, various reasons. Again, the number of reasons, Jonathan Vance has a good analysis of all the many, many reasons why people enlisted in a citizen army. But I didn't know much about the activities of First Nations soldiers. So for me, it was a huge discovery. And I think, for many reasons, not just that one, a hugely important book. And then from there, I mean, to start looking at it, I was teaching it, so then I had to find, well, who was Francis Picamagabo? And there had, at about that time, the Hayes book, a slim little volume that I got a hold of, came out with, you know, just like this, a biography of Francis Picamagabo. And the absolutely foul way in which he was treated by Canadians after he came home. And he was decorated in the war, and he was a sniper. So it's all nasty work, but it's a nasty job. And I also haven't been aware of the extent of the role in the Great War that women played. And I had no idea until I saw that film a year ago, Tricks on the Dead, about this 85,000 mainland Chinese men who had been dragooned, basically, and shipped out. And, well, they were treated horribly in Europe, but they were not exactly treated well on Canadian soil during the time that they were in transit across the country. So, you know, we're learning more and more about all of this, and more of it is apparent about World War II than the Great War, but I suspect there's a lot more to discover. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Oh, Marjorie, always.
Could you tell me a research story that is during the work on Findlay, or maybe on the war book? What was the most interesting or exciting moment when you sort of pulled out of those archives some wonderful thing? I'm sure you have more than one.
Oh, I've worked in archives here, in this library at UBC, when Special Collections was upstairs. On Malcolm Lowry, you know, extensively, and had many moments there where George will recall a great screech coming from the carols because I discovered something. And George and Anne were always willing to screech with me, even though you weren't supposed to screech in Special Collections, but they were pleased for me. More recently, I've had those moments working on Findlay. I'm writing Timothy Findlay's biography, and I've had to work in Library Archives Canada a lot, and forgive me for saying this in a library, but the collection hasn't been as well accessioned and so on as it should have been, and that comes from the fact that there was a period when Library Archives Canada was starved for funding. So the kind of archive I was used to working in here, which was just meticulous, I did not find there. However, that said, those moments for me came with reading Timothy Findlay's journals. He was an inveterate journal writer, and there are decades worth of personal journals, and some of the most moving of those journals deal with his early life. He started out as an actor in London, and some of the experiences and the agonies he went through. He knew he was a writer, he knew he was an artist, but he was trying to be an actor. And he was in despair over and over again. And at one point, and I was in the restricted reading room in LAC, where again, you're supposed to be very quiet and well-behaved. Oh, I said, for God's sake, Tiff. I mean, that's what I've come to call him now. That's what his friends, family called him. You're going to be famous. Stop whining. I don't recall who else was in that room with me at the time. But of course, the stupidity of that remark, but it was just, you know, oh, come on, it's going to be okay. He was 21 at the time. He didn't know things were going to be okay. That was a very moving experience for me. Another very moving experience was a letter, and I'm not going to tell you more about that because it's in the book and I have permission to reproduce it, in which he writes to the woman that he'd married long after that. Finlay was gay. Long after the marriage had ended in heartbreak for both of them. So more about that I won't say.
Well, thank you very much again, Sherril. That was wonderful, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming.